It is probably safe to say that retired Lieutenant General David Deptula is not much into talking politics or dramas being played out on Capitol Hill. He is into life and death issues. He is into sort of the things that are at stake right now, including aid for Israel and Ukraine and Taiwan that hangs in the balance of all of these politics. Try as I might to get him to talk politics, he never does. So I give up on that. So, General, it's always good having you, and thank you very much. But you wrote a very eloquent piece on this, so where you just said this is what's important and this is why it's important, this aid to these countries. But as you could see, the way it's playing out on Capitol Hill, not everyone agrees with you. Why is it so important?
Well, Neil, first of all, I think it's important to recognize that Israel and Ukraine are both engaged in fights that are directly tied to core U.S. interests. And frankly, we need to do all we can to see that they prevail in these wars, because if we don't, that will embolden our adversaries and will dramatically increase the odds that America's sons and daughters will ultimately have to spill their blood. There comes a point where evil must be checked. And my concern is that, unfortunately, too many Americans don't understand that, nor is there awareness that our military has been in decline while our adversaries are growing in power. I don't think folks recognize. Here's a good example. Our U.S. Air Force today is the smallest, the oldest, and the least ready in its history. Think about that. The B-52, the backbone of the free world's bomber force, just celebrated its 72nd anniversary of its first flight.
Wow.
And while not as geriatric, similar challenges can be found in nearly every service. So the world's on fire, Neil, and the United States is woefully unprepared, and that demands a conversation during this election year.
Well, you're getting that conversation, to your point, General, but it might not be going the way you like. It's certainly among a lot of Republicans who are open to aid for Israel, not so much to Ukraine. What do you think of that?
Well, I think it's extraordinarily short-sighted in the degree of ignorance, and I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. Yeah. I mean it in the context of an absence of knowledge of what has gone on before is appalling. Not just in Congress, but in our major universities and among their faculty. Now, the United States has faced these decision windows before, and it's done the right thing. The leaders of past eras stood on the side of right, and today's leaders need to do the same thing.
But they're not. And I'm not saying all of them. The fact of the matter is these protests that have been popping up all over the country at some of our most elite institutions, General, they call into question whether Israel's worth that sacrifice, worth that cost, that it comes at a tremendous, sacrifice financially and morally, they say to us. Some are even waving pro-Hamas signs as they walk in the shadow of what used to be the World Trade Center. How do you feel about that?
Well, as we've discussed before, these protests are not accidental nor spontaneous. They're part of a concerted set of information operations crafted by our adversaries to create friction and discontent inside the United States. Look, Iran, Russia, and China have huge malign information efforts designed to capitalize on our freedoms of speech, while at the same time, they control and suppress what's allowed to be heard and said inside their own countries. Now, these U.S. university students and faculty participating in these extreme protests, frankly, are dupes, and they're displaying gross ignorance of how they're being manipulated. And in some cases, these protests are inciting violence, and the perpetrators should be arrested and convicted as terrorists. I would remind you and our audience that the First Amendment does not protect speech that incites imminent violence or lawlessness, which some of the protesters have been engaging in.
General, I want to go back to the war in Israel, and I want to get your thoughts or what has gotten to be a sort of assessment, always dangerous when that's accepted at face value, where Israel's response was tactical, precise, surgical, sent a message to Iran. Iran doesn't look like it will respond. So these two have eased their tensions. There's not going to be any more dust-ups. There might be down the road with proxies, as there has been for what has been many, many years. but that the worst is over. That's a consensus building between those two countries. I'm not talking about Israel's ongoing war with Hamas. What do you think of that?
Well, Neil, I think the Israeli action this past week was a pretty well-crafted response. If we view it through a lens of deterrence, Israel successfully demonstrated its ability to defeat Iran's mass aerial assault, and that's an element of deterrence all on its own. Then the limited strike the Israelis executed in response was calibrated to demonstrate their ability to strike inside Iran while at the same time preserving their relationship with Saudi Arabia and others who seek to provide a counterweight to Iran without open conflict. And what this course of action also did was preserve Israel's relationship with the United States, who urged restraint and prevented a flare-up of Hezbollah on the northern border of Israel. So Israel satisfied the demands for response to Iran's attack without opening a new campaign in an already complex conflict with Iran's proxy. So I think the bottom line is Israel's stronger today and Iran's weaker, but don't think by any measure that this is the end of Iran's long war against Israel and the United States.
General Deptula, thank you very much, and for your service to this country as well. Thank you.
Have a great day.
All right, General Deptula.